In today's episode, I'm joined by Dr. Kelly Starrett, physical therapist, coach, author, and one of the people who helped bring mobility training into the mainstream. If you've spent any time in strength and conditioning, CrossFit, or modern rehab over the last decade, there's a good chance his work has influenced how you move, train, and recover. In this conversation, we zoom out. We talk about where mobility training actually came from, how it evolved from physical therapy and strength culture into what we see today, and why so much of it is still misunderstood. We also dig into where things are headed next, from durability and movement practice to how athletes and everyday people can build bodies that last. So whether you're a coach, clinician, athlete, or someone who just wants to move and feel better for a long time, this episode is packed with insight. You're listening to Real World Coaching Podcast. We break down the art and science of coaching with real conversations and practical frameworks.
Each episode gives you clear takeaways you can use today, so your playbook gets sharper and your coaching gets results in the real world.
All right. How's it going, Kelly?
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you as well. First time face-to-face interaction. We've had some communication online in recent years. But I was reflecting before our chat today on just how much you've had an impact on my coaching since I started. I became certified in personal training in 2005. So it's, quite a while for me now, but reflecting on having you on as a guest today and just thinking, back to that time. And, we're going to get into some of that discussion now, but it's been a long time. You've had a big impact on where I have gone as a coach and some of the decisions that I've made over the years. And that's definitely helped me along the way. So I appreciate everything that you do and taking the time to sit down with me.
Well, I thank you for saying that. 20 years is enough time to have corrected those wrongs. So if I led you the wrong way, I appreciate you saying that. I just want to frame for everyone that the world has changed pretty radically in 20 years. Yeah. The information that we have, the access, the democratization of a lot of this, and frankly, the confusion, and that back in 2004, 2005, there really isn't a ton. And you're lucky enough if you came out of circus, if you came out of gymnastics, if you came out of track and field, or you knew an Olympic lifting coach, you were on the program. The rest of us were really struggling with I had this high school or college sports performance thing. And, maybe, the bodybuilding scene is really influencing what you're doing. You're reading Muscular Development, trying to figure out, how to put a program together, and you discover Pavel. And it's one of the first times where you're like, oh, wait a minute. So I just want to frame for everyone that the things we take for granted now did not exist in 2005. Absolutely. And it was a really different landscape. And, the degree of confusion and sophistication simultaneously is real. Yeah. And it's going to be interesting to hear where this conversation goes as we talk about what is important and what we're still getting right and wrong.
Yeah, I think that would actually be a great place to start because a lot of people, I think, know you for Supple Leopard, becoming the Supple Leopard. And that was released around 2013 timeframe, 2014. And around that time, that as a coach, I was starting to move into 10 years now into training. And that was almost like how people introduced themselves to me. Have you read Supple Leopard? Have you read, so it was and that's, Nova Scotia, it was that book had such a huge impact on the industry. But even prior to that, it was nice for me to have been a part of that, what's going on here? Things are changing. Because in 2005, their mobility training wasn't mainstream and it wasn't a concept. It was we just trained people. I worked with athletes.
Even the word mobility is one that we consciously chose. Yeah. No one was using the word mobility. The only reference to it was a book called Magnificent Mobility. And I think it was kind of about warm-ups and dynamic work, done by Eric Cressy, believe it or not. And, as a physio, I mobilized tissues. Mm-hmm. And, one of the things I really liked about the idea of mobility was not only did you have to have the range of motion, but you needed to have control of the range of motion. And, right. What we tried to do is say, hey, look, right now in stretching and flexibility, it's just you're more stretching, more. And Athletes didn't know why they were doing it, didn't necessarily make them feel better. And they still didn't have access to these positions. They were doing a lot of things working around the problem until the problem became really bad.
Mm-hmm.
And as you saw, 10 years of coaching, people were showing up and suddenly being asked to engage in a legit strength and conditioning program for the first time in their lives. Right. And they're like, you're like, you can't put your arms over your head. Your hip doesn't flex. You have no control here.
Yeah.
Much less doing an overhead squat. You can't even get into these shapes without, putting yourself into human Jenga. So, that point, we recognize that the dangerous idea of Supple Leopard was that this information belonged in the gym, and the gym was also the place to talk about positional restoration and positional quality. Not because in 2004, 2005, it's really the emergent and nascent chasing of physical capacity as a measure of fitness. The more watts you could put on, another kilo that you could do. One of the guys who did really well in the games a long time ago, someone asked him, what would be the perfect workout for you? And he's like, 100 thrusters at 135 pounds. Like that's, and I was like, whoa, that's no different than the Tour de France, or, track cyclists on the watt bike. Really, does that make us a better athlete? Does it give us permission and additional movement solutions? Clearly that's a freakish, amount of output, but that was the beginning of that conversation where we really stopped losing athleticism, or we started losing athleticism. We started really worshiping this person who could go up and down. And you can see at the time, there's a beginning of a pushback against this a little bit from people like Ido Portal and the physical culture world, which was saying, hey, it's really great that we're very strong, very capable now. And we weren't very strong back in 2004, 2005. I mean, no one was. We weren't strong, we weren't skilled. No one was on rings. No one can, handle a barbell very well. Kettlebell, you couldn't buy them in San Francisco. And you literally had to drive to Santa Cruz to buy kettlebells. And so, again, you can buy those things at Target now. So what we saw was this sort of push into physiology, and it was good. It was really the trappings of a beginning of getting a lot of people into a formal strength and conditioning program, and one that really respected conditioning well. I think that was the other thing that was starting to layer in for the first time, is we weren't just doing monostructural bike shit as warm up. Mm-hmm. And then what we started to see was sort of the erosion of range of motion, the erosion of care about movement choice and coordination. And there are still pockets. I mean, Franz Bosch, who is one of my favorite coaches, Dutch coach, he says good strength conditioning training is coordination training with resistance. And, and you can suddenly, again, begin to understand some of the pushback from this physical culture, because what we saw was that people were shutting down their movement choices and shutting down their ability to solve novel problems because they've gotten so stiff and so powerful. And I think the chief expression of this was that everyone started looking around and saying, what can we steal from these different domains? And looked at, powerlifting, we were like, oh, look at these guys. I mean, they squat 600-700 pounds. That's what we were going. Meanwhile, watching Larry Wheels sprint on a treadmill was, not great. Watching some of our big, strong athletes who were the strongest, most brutal people ever, suddenly were not as springy and dynamic as they could be. And so I think this little correction back, where simultaneously mobility became necessary in CrossFit to be able to do the movements. If you're going to full snatch, you really have to have at least normative range of motion. And then simultaneously, I think, one of the things that we're coming around now is saying, okay, we've got enough capacity. How do I build athleticism? And the real conversation is how much athleticism can really be built in the gym. And if we look at your work, you guys are doing such a wonderful job of saying, hey, this gym can be a place of exploration and capacity. And now that's a really good tool for us then to take those lessons and actually go back into sport. And I think that's where it's easy to get caught in what E.O. Wilson calls artifacts of scholarship, where we're just arguing about foot position and 3 degrees here. And you're like, have you ever played a game or done a sport? Because it's all that crap goes out the window,
Yeah. I reflect around that time, and I as a personal trainer and a strength coach, I was really pulled to powerlifting. So, that if you think around before that, like CrossFit boom, it was kind of like this bigger, faster, stronger era, right? Like we're pulling from West Side Barbell methods. There's a lot of cool ideas there, but there really was this huge gap missing, and we're getting strong as hell and we're doing a crazy amount of power work. But how are we also addressing movement qualities and in a way where it's just not agility ladders or directional change stuff? And oftentimes, if you think, like when I think back, it was kind of easier to work with athletes because they're playing their sport and you can kind of coach and correct them through that. And a lot of them do have pretty good movement qualities already from playing sport. But then this boom of CrossFit takes off. And now you have Gen Pop coming in the gym. And now everyone wants to be an athlete. Now everyone, which is great. But now you have this person in front of you that hasn't really done that in a long time. They want to snatch and clean. They want to climb a rope and they want to jump and do all this stuff. And that was kind of where I found we needed some kind of answer to this. Like, how can I get this person moving better? They're not that athlete that I was just working with, right?
And let me circle something that is really, I think, inherent to what you said. Intrinsic is the other thing is that we suck the joy and exploration out of the gym. The gym became this highly decorative place where I'm working on all of these physical attributes and capacities, and we're not playing around. We're not exploring. One of the things that I loved about Westside was all the informal competitions. And I was lucky enough to go to, Westside and train. And I actually had my lifetime PR squat in front of Lou, which was amazing. I was squatting with the women at the time. I was the weakest woman on the platform. And Laura Phelps got into my lifetime PR and tripled it on her way up to 700 or 800. She was, but in that culture of the gym where people came in, it wasn't, initially because we have all these new tools, it really is novel, and where the brain is going crazy because we have to learn all of the new way to pull up, a different way of pulling up. Suddenly I'm on the rings. I handle this barbell, handle these dumbbells, handle this kettlebell, right, under these different domains. And I think one of the things that happens is that stuff starts to become stale. We stop having the beginner games of the learning, trying to, problem solve, and it becomes really sophisticated step aerobics with weights. And where exactly how many calories you can row in this minute, you can, I can push up this, push press this, or be dynamic. What's interesting then is when the gym remains fun and we see all of these games and the things that you're playing with, exposure, control, really is a nice language that should be part of the gym experience. Not, hey, I know exactly how many double unders I can do in 8 seconds in this transition, because again, that ends up being very cutesy after a while. And I'm not saying that all our games athletes are cutesy. I'm just saying that kind of training really ends up potentially throttling athleticism, right. And it forces the body into specific patterns that maybe don't give us the potential outputs that we should be deriving from the gym. And this is one of the reasons why I have to even remind really good coaches: are you playing sports? Are you training athletes who are playing sports? Because this training session you're doing is really dense, but now my athletes can't go swim. They can't compete. They can't do their sport because you crushed them in the gym. So really now we're at a place where we can have the conversation about what's the minimum effective dose here and how do I enhance that athlete's time on the field. So she's on the pitch, she is feeling better, and it's not about this recursive training. And I'll tell you, pull-ups are the dumbest sport in the whole world. It's a dumb sport. I mean, you should not be doing pull-ups in sport. Pull-ups are a way to make your sport better. Full stop.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's an interesting reflection too, because studying some of the best game athletes, a lot of people get surprised, like I was at the time too, diving into CrossFit as it blew up and seeing the best weren't actually doing a lot of like work capacity WOD stuff. It was like they would train and they would really keep themselves coordinated, well-rounded, and then they would practice these things. whereas everyone else was kind of hammering wads and just going in the gym and not really working on those athletic qualities that make you more well-rounded. So
So many of those athletes who were winning were collegiate athletes, gymnasts. Like they were actually had the components of athleticism as a requisite starting point. And something you circle back to what you said was that suddenly in your own training, you're like, hold up, you can do a lot of work on the Peloton, but that's not making you a better skier. It's really strange. I wonder what's going on here. And we really have to start asking differently about, hey, what are the needs, and how does my strength conditioning program evolve into tissue protection of these end ranges, and fun and exploration. I mean, we may not ever be as dynamic and as fun as you. You do some really fun stuff, but the idea here is that all of these things should be scaled and should be part of the language of how do I reinforce these positions and help people become bomb-proof in these shapes so that they can go out into the world. And you jump into a yoga class, and that's a poor expression of a sport, but like you don't drown because you're like, oh yeah, this is just different kind of movement.
Yeah. It is fun for me as well these days, like diving a little harder into some of the unconventional weird things in a way where, sometimes I do get some backlash on that and pushback, like no one should ever do that or whatever, this, athletes and that. And it's like, well, that's not really what I'm saying. What I'm doing is I'm trying to see what these people or what this thing is at that level or with that capacity. And then
That's right.
try to draw from it something that would help and say, like, let's make a educated or intelligent kind of decision around some of these things. But at the end of the day, a lot of that shit is super fun.
It's super fun. And, the gym is the one place where I think it's very safe. You're the safest you can be inside the gym. And if you don't let your ego check write all the checks, you can really engage in a lot of play and a lot of fun without, potentially absolutely trashing yourself.
Yeah.
But where it gets crazy is all of a sudden is when I think there's the bottom line is, what should we be doing in the gym? What's the best use of our time so that we can have people become effective movers? And that's really the magic, right? That's it.
Yeah.
How to feel better in their bodies. And as I'm cresting in my 50s and still working on the splits and doing all the fun ththings, it's really about tissue health for me. Right. I don't ever want to pull anything. I don't want to rip anything. I want to get, I'm going to, accidents and catastrophes are going to happen when I'm doing the sports that I do. That's feature, but the rest of this should be, this should be the safest place on the earth. And I should be obsessed with not capacity, but, health.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I get that question a lot around splits. Like how long do you think you're going to be able to do that for? Or, should people be doing that at later ages in life? And it's like, well, when you change the thought process around exposing your tissues to these ranges versus just trying to chase the splits, that's when I think it becomes a better long game for just knowing a little bit more than just the basic kind of traditional in and out of the gym sort of thing. Over the last 20 years on the gym floor, I've learned that while trends come and go, the foundation of an unbroken body rarely changes. That's part of why I started Field Notes, a monthly dispatch on what I'm currently testing, what my athletes are doing, and the lessons that only show up when you spend years coaching real people in the real world. If you've been enjoying the Real World Coaching podcast, there's a good chance you'll enjoy Field Notes too. You can sign up through the link in the description. All right, let's get back to the conversation. Question for you here. With a lot of the changes that have happened, a lot of people were introduced to mobility through your videos and a lot of the early online content. You were one of the first that were putting that out. How much do you think the internet has changed the way movement education is now spread compared to the traditional coaching world that we kind of come from?
Well, I think there's two things. One is it's really everyone comes from somewhere. And one of the things that I'm a fan of is this concept of Wakapapa, which is a Maori in New Zealand idea of where's your lineage? Where do you come from? Who are your teachers? Who are your uncles and aunties and sort of senseis?
And it's really easy to just pretend like you thought of this idea. You don't have to show your associations because it's this little snippet. And I think that really dishonors generations of really smart coaches who got us here and that we're building on someone's work. And it's not always convenient to always be saying like, hey, this idea comes from so-and-so, but people do not show their work enough. The second thing is that all of the accounts that I follow that are interesting are coaches who point positive. This is the way we think it should be done. This is how we do it. Here's my work. The first person to do this was Joe DeFranco. He would film his entire sessions with his with his football athletes, and you could actually see the choices that he was making in real time. You know, you could see all the mistakes that his athletes made, and so he was very transparent. And there's really a lack of transparency on the internet right now. You don't really see who people are working with. You can't tell what their bona fides are. And it's to a place where I'm like, hey, you're making a lot of claims. Can I see where you're applying your thinking? And there's nothing wrong with being a personal trainer in a commercial gym, filming yourself, making a living. There's nothing wrong with that. But you are making a lot of claims and haven't really tested your stuff. Like, go ahead and bring that to a university. Let's see how it goes. Let's see that long-term athletic development with 12-year-olds. How does that go? Hey, have you worked in the NFL, the NBA, NHL, Olympics? Are you really, talking and what does that look like? And, the other thing that the internet has done is that it's truncated systems thinking in terms of idea. Do this one thing to fix your squat. Do this, and everyone knows ultimately. I mean, that's really like, those are people speaking to dilettantes and beginners. That is not a sophisticated structural program. And so oftentimes what we see is that people have created these amalgamations of things that look like I think the technical word is a kludge. You have a piece of software and you keep bootstrapping things on. And what you have is this kind of chunky, I can't tell what your through line is. What is your important positions? How are you thinking about regression and progression? And then what is essential for you to develop someone from a child all the way up to an Olympian? What does that look like? Can I see your through thinking? Because all the best coaches in the world I know could coach 12-year-olds, 8-year-olds, and then all the way, and then step into, premier soccer and be like, yeah, I could be a strength and conditioning coach for this. I can understand these things. So we understand how to regress and progress. So the internet has made it so that if you have abs and, and enough, gnarly things to say about someone else, you can get some attention, but that doesn't necessarily move the ball, improve the community. It doesn't allow for collaboration. And so it's really kind of a shit show. And then simultaneously, still wonderful because we get to see, I see all your work and I get to see what you're thinking and what you're working on. And I can see your progressions and I love how transparent you are and showing your associations. And that's awesome. And that's the real power of this thing, is that we can become curious and become interested in what's going on. I'll tell you, two examples I think are really great. I love David Weck's rope flow. I think his rope flow stuff has solved so many rotational problems at the elbow and the wrist and the shoulder. It ties the shoulder into a lot of spinal movements. And I'll say my critique of rope flow is that it can be your whole identity, and you can actually do things with your wrist now that's like, it doesn't actually move the shoulder very much. You're not ever putting your arm over your head. You're not really side bending. You're not really rotating. And when we just strip it down to its essentials, then what you see is, wow, this is the best prep for my major league pitchers ever. This is the best things from getting thermogenic with my athletes. Rope flow is a good example of, David Weck sent me some ropes and, in the pandemic in 2000 or, 2020, and it was like, hey, play around with this, see what you think. And I was like, holy shit, this is great. All the tennis ball flow that we've continued to see, where people are, going beyond just F1 dropping, and suddenly we have people catching and bringing nervous system on and hand-eye coordination and, the vestibular stuff. Those are great examples of how good ideas, promulgate through an ecosystem. And simultaneously, what you can see is, what is the hottest thing this week? And you can definitely start to get a feel for trends, and everyone jumps on a trend. And, There are zombie arguments out there and zombie ideas that will never go away. Rounding your back is dangerous. And you're like, Jesus Christ, is that really what we're talking about still, so I think the internet is a two-edged sword, and simultaneously, you can become a very powerful Jedi if you follow the right people who are transparent, who never punch down, and who like to point positive. Those are incredible resources. And you should be able to suddenly be in a cabal of relationships like this one.
Yeah, that's a good reflection. It's probably one of the questions I get the most from other coaches that are older is like, we are now in this kind of, era where you're not forced to go online, but it's a big market and it's very accessible. And the accessibility of it is kind of, it's hard in a way where you're trying to figure out how to start doing it. And I reflect sometimes on how this all started for me. And it was, I guess, not as specific as Joe DeFranco's example, but I just shared training. I don't, when I reflect and talk to any other coaches, I always just say, just share your training, because you're always working on something. If you are actually helping people, at least share what you're working on and what you're actually finding from it, versus this idea of like, these 3 hip exercises will fix your hip, right? It's like, well, there's a lot of nuance to that. And maybe there's hip exercises that I've used now for so long that I like to post and say, these are great options. But it is hard for a lot of coaches that are older now these days, because there's a lot of opportunity online, but now kind of picking and choosing how you're going to start. Do you want to start calling people out? Is that how you want to start? Because, you see a lot of people trying to gain momentum that way. And it's like, I don't really see that being a long-term strategy versus, sharing the work. Right.
And there are brilliant coaches who've been working for a long time on complex problems. And I'll pick on someone that I know, and this is not a critique, but people like to attack Mike Boyle as an example. And I want everyone to understand that, like, Boyle strength conditioning, existed in a time where people could not get legitimate coaching unless they were at the Olympic Training Center or maybe an Olympic track and field program. The first time I was at his facility a long time ago, you can see how he structured his facility, because he's making choices about, hey, I'm working with 500 or 600 athletes a day. What choices do I make there in terms of the flow? How do we get the biggest bang for the buck? How are we efficient? I mean, you have 5 athletes in a day. That's very different than being responsible for the programming and progression for 500 people who are actually doing sports. And so you can start to believe that you've got a model that supports what you're doing, but you want to remain curious about, why does Mike Boyle think that way? And it's easy to not have enough experience where you're like, that's dumb, or I don't do that, or I don't believe in that. And simultaneously, again, Mike is an old friend and comrade, but I would point out that there are many ways to skin the cat. And what you could want to always try to do is curious about, why are people having success? What are the pieces of that success? Why is that coach doing an amazing job with these athletes? Why are the athletes so prepared? What is it about the community, the environment, the communication? And then what you really see is that, boy, coaching a human being is a very sophisticated, issue. Being a personal trainer is not just moving the pins and, being rah-rah. And that really, if you're going to help be responsible for someone's physical movement system, you're going to need to be competent in sleep and stress. And you have to talk about nutritional basics and can you warm up and how do you keep people entertained and how do you get them actually strong and what are you measuring, And I think what we start to see is, boy, this is worthy of a life's work. But you're going to have to become a lot more sophisticated than I could program 6 weeks of a bench press progression for you.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've found over the years, a lot of those, the extra education is always great, but it is never really anything my client, depending on the client I'm working with, needs to really know. It's like, and they don't care. Right. So it's like, you want to grab, as much of that along the way, the, extra education or new ideas that are being thought, and then still find a way to make sure this person enjoys the session and still gets the bang for their buck out of whatever these ideas are that you're presenting them.
When we were in 2004, 2005 and beyond, we were traveling, and really through 2012, 2014, we were doing a lot of traveling to courses. This is something that every coach did. Someone was doing something novel. And the number of like running courses, strongman courses, powerlifting courses, like I did so many, weekend exposure seminar things. That was part of the thing. How do I work with kids? How are these people solving this problem? What's their system? And that was very normal and normalized. I sound like the old guy. When I was in physio school, Mike Bergner, who is my Olympic lifting sensei, ran these weekend, USAW, CrossFit weightlifting, Olympic style weightlifting seminars. And we come in and sort of, soup to nuts, really help you understand what are the essentials. And this was based on he was coaching high school at the time, and he'd go home to his gym and he'd coach Olympians. And so you could really see, his thinking through the line. What is essential here and how do we regress and progress? And I would go down and sleep on a friend's couch and, fly myself down and then, be there at 6 a.m. and volunteer all day just so I could be in the room with him. And I felt so lucky that I tricked him into letting me be one of his, junior assistant coaches in training who knew nothing about Olympic style weightlifting. But I, got exposed to 10,000 drills, and watching a master coach, weekend after weekend was really insightful in terms of my development and the cues I use, the thinking, the strategic development of me as an Olympic lifting coach. So I think that piece where, to go and work out with someone, and even the master coaches today are like, oh, you're interested? I'll see you at 5 a.m. Like, you know what I mean? Like, go ahead and lift there in front of Lou Simmons. And I'll tell you, you're going to learn a whole different thing than critiquing someone online.
Yeah. I've reflected on that a bit, and I feel like the COVID kind of era kind of killed some of that, because that was very much the case for me too. You're always trying to find the next seminar, workshop to attend, or mentor, right? Like you're spending time mentoring with people for a longer period of time to actually understand the ins and outs of their thought process and what they're doing. Have you thought about that? And why do you think this mentorship kind of era I don't know if it's dying or it's phased out?
I think you can have good success without a mentor very, very fast. It's easy to suddenly, have an Instagram account, get a little hot, and then you're like, I don't need this, and it is hard because you see people scrambling around and becoming experts in all these different things. And, what's resonating with people. Let me double down on that. Oh, it's not working. Let me come back and I'll just, start to say like, knee valgus is fine. Like, okay, now I've started an internet war again with my own little community. I feel important again. And, again, those are all artifacts of the internet. And, everyone, I think there's really some resistance about being a student and being a beginner and being in program. And, right now, probably the colleges are doing the best job of that. You have to be a young graduate assistant. You work through, I'm not saying that's a healthy environment for people, right? They, work too much and are underpaid. But, really, where are we getting long-term coaching development? And people are starting to think critically about that, and in sort of, we have these institutionalized methods, ACSM, et cetera, and SCA in the United States, they don't necessarily develop the kinds of coaches we're after either. Right. Mm-hmm. But what you can start to see is, hey, we need at least some ongoing coach development. Where and who is stepping up and what does that look like? Because right now I think people are drowning in, on Instagram education, and they don't know how these things put together. And that's what's evident when you watch people, do this one 4x4 aerobic program. Like, okay, I'm just going to do this 4x4 Copenhagen aerobic development system for the rest of my life. I'm going to be miserable and I'm not going to get the results I want. You really need to become an expert in programming, and there are experts out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You got to keep looking. One of the discussions we had that kind of initiated this whole episode was, the growth of mobility training. It's so big now. It's hard to even know what's coming at you, right? Like, or what the perception of what mobility training should look like should be. With that growth has obviously also created this like, my mobility approach is better. This is bad. This is good, sort of thing. And within that discussion, the stretching being outdated or ineffective comes up a lot. It's the clickbait for most new mobility coaches. Like, stop stretching, do mobility. Stop stretching, do mobility. It's like there's a nuanced discussion there for sure, but sometimes people lean into what gets the views or the attention. How do you think about the role of stretching today within a mobility practice?
Well, let's define what you mean by stretching. So, I mean, here's the problem with when we said flexibility. I was like, those are the properties of a rubber hose. Like, I'm not sure I want to be flexible. I want to be able to access my positions and shapes. I want to be springy and dynamic. Stretching, I think, is just, if we define it clearly, then there's a clear role in that. So, I think one of the ways of thinking about stretching is we can borrow from our friend Pavel, who would be like, hey, let's do these end range isometrics. And you're like, oh, isometrics, end range, I'm in. I'm like, oh, welcome to stretching again, bro. And, like you just didn't define your terms. And I think if you bend over and feel it pull on something and you do that for 10 seconds, you shouldn't be surprised that changes. I think there's a South African term, fuck all, sweet fuck all. It doesn't change anything, and, but that doesn't mean that that's not a valuable technique and tool. I think what we're beginning to understand even better is that we always need to take a systems approach to these things, and that, what tools do I have available to me? Where am I? What is the athlete expected to do after this? Right. And if you're going to be just a circus freak, and I mean that I worked with Cirque du Soleil, I mean that in like term of endearment, like you can hammer on these end range tissues and become very hypermobile and, but you never expected to run down a pitch, play water polo. You're not doing strength conditioning plus 3 hours of practice. One of the real questions here is when and where are we going to put this stuff in, and who owns this stuff? So stretching is a great way in to some of the classic shapes and patterns, but we don't really apply it. Like, are we really doing, like, maybe you stretch your pecs and you stretch your hamstrings, but like people don't really stretch. Maybe they do some middle splits, right? But there's not really stretching going on, right? In terms of the sort of some of the classic pieces. And again, if we come back and say, well, let's look at what the elite gymnasts are doing. Wow, they do a lot of things that look like stretching. What about the elite, ballet dancers, people whose range of motion requires them to have, access to these shapes, their job, their skill. Suddenly you're seeing very sophisticated range of motion drills, and simultaneously just sometimes pulling on a tissue at end range doesn't give us sort of all the results that we wish we had. And so sometimes we might need some soft tissue work. We might need to, bias, if all of that stretching had worked, and I'm just going to put everything that we were doing for pain, resolution of position into one category, stretching. Why were there so many physios? Why were there so many chiros? Why was there ART? Why are there Rolfers? And then the same question is, if you saw a Rolfer and you didn't get 100% fixed, or you did ART, maybe it wasn't an ART or a Rolfing related problem, where you didn't have problems with your sliding surfaces, right? You could address, aspects of the movement system like trigger points, which are real and valid, whether you believe in them or not. And, how are you managing that pain piece or that tissue restriction in the context of this bigger thing? So if you only have one tool, then you are going to try to misapply that tool over and over again. But I think if you ultimately recognize that most of everything that we do with the body in terms of position ends up being an isometric, whether we're putting a heavy ball or a heavy kettlebell on the quad, that's just a different kind of isometric. While we're, doing 30-second holds, 4-second holds, minute holds, there's still end range isometrics of some kind. or we go slower. So it's either tempo or isometrics. So whether you're doing slow eccentrics to try to deal with muscle stiffness, welcome back to tempo, right? Eccentric neural grooving, however you're going to dress this up, it's still going to be, I'm either stopping or I'm moving slowly. And then suddenly you're like, okay, now we have a conversation that really begets tissue change. You should also know what you're trying to change to. What is normal range of motion? Does this athlete need this? Is this the best use of time? Can she put her arms over her head and have that control? Great. Now we get to have the next conversation. Maybe that's just about DOMs or keeping tissue sliding and gliding. But, to your point, we don't want to throw away really excellent tools. My PT education here in the Bay Area, I went to a really incredible manual skill school where we were an Australian approach school. Manual techniques and therapies and putting hands on and mobilizing joints was part of the game. And simultaneously, I spent a lot of time at the World Center for PNF at Kaiser Vallejo. So very much using the body's ability to sense change and perceive change to make change with the tissues. That's the heart of PNF. So suddenly when we were doing those contract, relax, hold, relax, those are just different forms of isometrics, using the body's natural inhibition mechanisms to try to facilitate other movement or position. So if you don't have a classical education, you don't even know what you're doing. You're playing press and guess, and you're telling everyone else that their secret scroll program doesn't work.
Yeah, that's kind of where I came from with the whole stretching thing. Is I was very much against it during my powerlifting years. And, I was more so just kind of jumping on board with what I was being told and what I was being referred to, and kind of got to a point where I wanted to at least educate myself around these techniques and around them and go through that journey myself before I could make that decision. That's kind of how I approach most things now. But now on the back end of that, it's the real issue is no one actually knows how to stretch. There's no education, there's no, what am I doing in this stretch? What am I doing in these positions? And that's what it was for me, is like, well, in reality is like, I just didn't know how to coach this stuff. So
yeah. And that's a big deal. I mean, you're a user yourself and had come from these experiences. And now you're like, when do I put this in? And more importantly, what am I cutting out to put this in? And when is the best time to do this stuff? And so suddenly it's not really a conversation about mobilization. It's not, we like to say in gross categories, the reasons we mobilize are, number one, you're in pain. So let's restore your range of motion. Let's address tissue restriction or tissue sensitivity, right? You just, your knee hurts because your calf is so stiff or so lit up from the thousands of jumping mechanisms you did yesterday. Well, we can just do some soft tissue work, some contract, relax, desensitize that in the brain, restore your range of motion, and all of a sudden your knee doesn't hurt. Great. The second thing is, we can decrease DOMs. Like, people forget that stretching feels good and that we can actually do things that feel good, that rolling around actually should feel good. And we can decrease sort of the session cost from the training session by doing some of this. Maybe we're slipping into this nebulous word like recovery, but that soft tissue work can be really, really useful for down regulation, for managing DOMs. And then the last, what's your plan to restore your range of motion? Because it turns out heavier squats did not solve the problem, right? and people want to believe you just need to squat. I'm like, yeah, you need to squat right? Yeah. So I think it's not this or that, it's this and that. And now you can ask, well, what tools do you have available to you? What's your time constraint? When are you going to put it in? And all you need to do, again, is come work with a professional team or a university team, and you're going to really come up, your perfect 3-hour session in the gym is, not realistic and impossible. And these athletes have to go and, be athletes and humans and study and compete and be in the gym. And what you see is that no one owns the problem.
Right. No, that's a good reflection. Like with the growth of mobility training, like as it's become so popular now, are there ways that you have seen it being, I guess, misapplied, misunderstood, or maybe even oversimplified?
Well, we defined mobility. So just so we're clear, it's our systems approach to returning your range of motion and control of that range of motion, right? And now if I'm going to Gen Pop, then I'm going to say so that you can be pain-free and you can do what you want to do with your body, those things. The key is that sometimes now people are like, they're doing hurdles and they're like, I'm doing mobility. And I'm like, okay. Is everything mobility? I think that's the question here is everything mobility. And, a squatting might change your range of motion, but it is not a mobility practice. Right. And so the real thing that we're trying to say is, hey, when and who owns this? When are you going to do it? And then typically it's about testing. Here's what my range of motion that I'm trying to achieve. I'm going to do an intervention and then I'm going to retest my range of motion. Test and retest is a big deal. And there's so much, we have simple rules like that, we borrowed from some of our masters. If you can't see change, you did not make change. So if that athlete is not springier, if you don't see a change in wattage and power and, motor efficiency, did you make any change? If you can't actually see the range of motion changes, did you make any change? What you did was, flop around and use your hypervolt and massage your leg. And massaging your leg with a hypervolt is great, but it's probably not going to radically change your range of motion. So, number one, the most important thing we can do is this long-term exposure to these positions. And I suspect the main problem is that we're not in shapes that we're trying to improve often enough. No wonder we are seeing a dearth of hip extension right now in this kind of current batch of athletes. We're always having to work on, hip extension. But if we take that idea that the number one thing we can do is try to just expose ourselves to these fundamental positions, suddenly you're like, oh, no wonder Ido Portal loves to hang from a bar 3 minutes a day, right? No wonder the gymnasts are walking on their hands obsessively. No wonder we do so much downward stinking dog in yoga because someone thought, hey, when we have people who are competent overhead, they are real good they have fewer shoulder problems, fewer neck problems, and they're more efficient at, some of these fundamental shapes like swimming. So, what you see is the first order of magnitude here is exposure to the position before we add anything else. Juliet and I, have gotten to a place where like, hey, we should probably just sit on the ground for 20 or 30 minutes in the evening every day. And part of that magic is just the exposure of these end range positions. Is that stretching? For a lot of people, it's gnarly stretching. Their hips are in range. Whether they're active or passive is sort of irrelevant. But exposure is the first game. And then we can layer in a different set of tools to solve a specific problem or bias a specific tissue system. But most people couldn't tell me, who are mobility experts. I'm like, and how much should the hip be able to rotate in flexion? I don't know. How much hip extension should I have? What does that look like in normative training? And what we see is hypermobile people showing their stunts on the internet without sort of a cogent system of saying, hey, here is what is full capacity and normal. Here's what all the textbooks say a human being shoulder should be able to do. Why aren't you there? What tools are we going to have to get there?
Right. Yeah. That's a good reflection. I look at stretching that way as well too, with it being an exposure technique. How can we expose something, even a front line of an injury? And I've used it that way myself more so in the last decade, is like if something flares up, kind of tweaky, I'll wait a little bit and I'll start using that as like a really light graded exposure to the injury.
We say mobilize at the position of restriction. That's one of the tenets of our model, is that you need to give those tissues context. And what you just said there is so sophisticated and so out of the domain of the typical person. Hey, it hurts to move. I'm not going to move this limb at all. I'm not even going to look at it. Hey, I can take myself to this place where I'm not in pain yet, right up to that mark. This is my available range today that my brain says, or my tissues say that I can handle. And I can begin to do isometrics there. I can begin to signal to my brain it's safe to generate force. It's safe to start moving. And that's really, really powerful, because you begin to sort of reestablish those open, chains of range of motion for your brain and for your tissues. And, let me just say it again, how sophisticated what you just said is, as a first way in, hey, let's just get you near here and take 10 breaths. And that's,
Right.
that's a form of stretching? Absolutely. We just need to expand this definition of what stretching is.
Yeah, absolutely. When you look back now on the things that you were teaching 10 or 15 years ago, I do this a lot. Sometimes those things come back, right? And it's like, and sometimes I think and reflect and I'm like, wow, are there any ideas about movement or mobility that you've really changed your mind on, like from those initial years when you started versus where you're at now? And also, just to second that, are there ideas that you've gone back to and you're like, wait a second, that was good stuff? Because, we often find
I started teaching a course about movement and mobility, I think in 2008. Is when I went up to Edmonton and taught a course there. And back in the day, people had no understanding basically of their body. Like I'd be like, these are your hamstrings, and then someone the next week would be like, I PR'd 300 pounds on my deadlift. I mean, it was just like, the bar was so low, right? And one of the things that I think I continue to just marvel on is, and I saw this in those notes from 2008, was the integration of breath into this and really appreciating some of the nuance of the yogis, of spending time, of signaling to the brain that these positions are safe, and really using the breath as a metric of, do I own this position or not? And then also using breath as sort of a volumetric or qualitative exposure to, hey, if you can take laying down, you can sort of take a maximum breath. There's no loads on the spine, no demands on the trunk. Stick your belly way out. That's going to be your biggest breath. And then we like to say roughly when you're upright in gravity and organized, you should be at about 90% of that reference volume on the ground. So there's going to be a small change as soon as I'm up in gravity. But then we can start to make decisions about some of the ways we organize ourselves based on, hey, in this position, I can maintain better range of motion. I can maintain better breath volume. This gives me an opportunity to say, hey, this shape is more effective at creating intra-abdominal pressure and maintaining my available physiology than this shape. So notice that we don't say fault. Like that was in the first book, we talked a lot of movement faults. And I'll say that that's a language we inherited from the masters in front of us, right? That's like actually a mulligan positional fault, a mulligan idea. And now I think it's more useful to say, hey, that's a strategy, and this strategy is less compensation, less work around the problem, maintains your physiology, transfers more effectively.
Right.
And that breath can give us a lot of ideas about some of those shapes and positions and can hypercharge the way my brain is interpreting what's going on. So if you're jumping on a roller because your quads are stiff, and turns out more squatting just made your quads stiffer, you might be surprised that as soon as you lay on that roller, it's really uncomfortable to compression. And none of your tissues should really be uncomfortable to compression. You should just feel like pressure. And so if you're laying on a child's pool toy, which is what a foam noodle is, a foam roller is a pool toy, and it's causing you to black out. Number one, we've learned a lot about your tissues. They're really stiff and fibrotic and sensitized. And number two, when you stopped holding your breath, you immediately start signaling to your brain that this is a threat position. So no wonder if you go to yoga and you're like, why am I spending 30 seconds in this pose? Well, it turns out that's a meaningful amount of time to get your brain comfortable with this end range isometric, expose you to some of these tissue loading, fatigue out. Some of the big prime movers have to start to do other motor unit recruitment, and you're going to have to take more than one breath. And so suddenly we can really signal to the brain, not only can I get in this position, but I can breathe in this position. And I would say more and more that breath has become such a through line. We're teaching a course this weekend, our level 2 assessment course. We have 30 coaches coming in. And the first thing I'll do is talk about breathing, because I see that as such an opportunity to get the trunk moving, desensitize painful situations, and then help us understand that some of the choices you're making when you have poor overhead shoulder position or you're lacking hip extension, you can't, if you get into a squat and you can't breathe, what are we talking about? And suddenly we start to see that I'm actually decreasing my aerobic function simply because my shoulders are stiff and my hips are stiff. That's crazy.
Yeah. That's a good reflection. I spent some time in the recent years getting into some of the PRI techniques, which go pretty crazy. It goes pretty deep.
Those
To a
people are
point where,
so smart and so great. They're on it. The real magic then is when and where do I put the stuff in?
right. Yeah.
Isn't it standalone? And I see a lot of really, a lot of professional teams will bring in experts to try to improve their team. And then I come in next, I'm like, what have you guys been working on? And I'm like, how come I don't see any of that going on in here? And what you see is that people don't know how to integrate it, or they can integrate it. And so for me, again, it comes back to when and where and who and what tools do you have? And, what is the exposure here? And it may be that we have 5 minutes to work on one problem. What's that going to look like? I'm going to make different decisions about, at Berkeley, I work at Berkeley as a volunteer physical therapist, but I travel with one of our teams full time. I'm their performance lead. So I travel, but once a week I do a MOB session. We just call it MOB. And it's just open clinic where we put out hotspots. We work on positions. The athletes can come in. It's unstructured. Usually I'm like, hey, here's a range of motion I want you to test that I want you to understand is your personal minimum. And then I teach these athletes how to work on each other. They can stand on each other. They can put hands on each other. They can mobilize. They can do isometrics. And what we're trying to do is shift this, because where are the athletes? They don't want to spend another hour at practice, but they do live together. And maybe at home in the evening is a place where they can be like, hey, my knee hurts, my shoulder hurts, my back hurts. What am I going to do about this? I can do it at home. So we think critically about this athletic experience, and mobility is a component to that in service of actually playing a game and having an outcome, not just more, the old Russian model. Like we had this coach, he would take a cigarette and coach you and he'd go, more of everything. We don't just need more of everything. Specifically, what are we going to do? So I think in that situation, we really do want to ask who and where and what, because that is the nuance and that is the game. Right.
Yeah, it's a good thought. One of the growing conversations around mobility, especially these days, and I think it's the number one question I get: should mobility be trained separately from strength training? And how do we see that relationship? Is it, there is that crowd that's just train through full range, right? Just everything through full range, machines, whatever, and you'll solve your problems.
Nope.
And then there also is the other crowd.
I want to stop right there. That does not work. That is absolutely very cool to say, because it gets you off the hook and it sheds personal responsibility. If you just do more ass to grass squats, well, I don't know. Have you ever seen the Chinese Olympic lifters? They get a lot of work done right there in the session. They have people walking on each other and doing gnarly partner mobilizations, partner stretches, crazy things in the context of the training lab. So if the Chinese are needing to do it, then you probably need to do it too.
Yeah, that's often not shared. You see the cool lifts, but you don't see what's going on in the background and stuff. But yeah, have you found even just over the years ways to fit them in, a strength session? We talked about Boyle, and one of the things I always loved about Boyle's work is he presents that this is how you fit everything in, right? And I think that's the big crutch a lot of people deal with when it comes to implementing a mobility practice. What kind of helpful strategies do you have where it, leads to a point where you might make it a separate thing, or building within the session? How has that kind of evolved?
Well, we never said you needed 3 hours of, joint mobilization before you lift it.
Right.
We have always said that laying on a foam roller is a terrible way to get ready for a fight. Mm-hmm. So if you want to get your ass kicked by my athletes, come in and go ahead and lay on the roller and start rolling around. This is not. So one of the things that we want to pull out is that soft tissue restoration and positional restoration aren't necessarily part of the warm-up game. Mm-hmm. I just did a talk with Sportsmith. We had a director of performance for Manchester, and then Rhett Larson, who is a strength conditioning coach for the German national volleyball team. He used to be the lead at Exos. We were talking about our goals during warm-ups are to optimize available range, get the tissues hot and sweaty, wake the athlete up, maybe get everyone on the same page. And if we were going to actually, go into the ring and have a fight, what does your warm-up look like? And it doesn't look like soft tissue mobilization. It doesn't. So number one is, where are we putting that? And we found was that there are a set of tools that work really well in the gym: heavy bands, barbells, so we might, as part in between of our warm-up sets, throw in a mobilization, which is basically just another isometric, just to give our athletes access to those positions very quickly. And what we find is that athletes tend to do things that work, and they repeat things that work and made them feel better, and they tend to reject things that don't work or don't serve them, right? And so when we give athletes tools that make this the intra-session work, right? The intra-session, then they tend to do this very well. And we tend to save the soft tissue work for afterwards, if we have time at the gym, or we move it to the home. And we can get our 10 or 15 minutes of down regulation soft tissue work when people are in front of the TV on the couch. So we have found that consistently works. And maybe as you're teaching people, you need to, carve out 5 or 10 minutes at the end of your session, or 5 minutes, and say, here's what I want you to do. I'm going to teach you this technique, and then you're going to go do this before you leave, and then I'm going to start my next session. So you can almost bleed that little bit of soft tissue restoration in there. Good warm-ups solve a lot of problems. They prep tissues, they get things perfused with blood, they give brain permission to access those shapes. And there is a mistake where people do not have a full range of motion program, and no wonder they're constantly battling the same things. So we simultaneously, as we come in and say, look, if you're, working with AJ Roberts, he was a, incredible strength athlete trying to bench 900. He turned out was missing all of his internal rotation on his shoulder. So that's a component to this shoulder extension. And all we did was give him his internal rotation back, and he put 80 pounds on his bench and did great and had less shoulder pain.
Crazy.
Why? Because we could quickly identify in the context of him benching, this is what you need. And so there really wasn't just this hey, how do we keep an eye on the whole system? We were doing this very targeted thing to solve this problem. Yeah. Then I had one of my Russian friends who was an incredible strength athlete, now lives in Latvia. He was experiencing the same thing. And so what I said to him was, hey, I want you to do these muscle snatches, these Cuban rotation muscle snatches with an empty bar just between your warm-up sets on bench. And so it was an easy way for us to have some internal rotation exposure, and he could just rep out sets of 15 with this 20-kilo bar. And he's like, man, my benching never felt as good. And so is that a mobility practice? Are we touching those shapes? Are we what's going on here? The real key here is identifying what the athlete needs to do and say, can I improve the efficiency and the economy of this position or access to this position? What are the tools that are available to me? And suddenly you're like, oh, this Cuban rotation turns out to be a really great way to work on this internal rotation, which may also be done with a barbell or a hand behind back or the bully stretch. We want to make sure that we're thinking about, what is it that this athlete needs to be more effective? What are the tools available to me, and where am I going to put those in? And that's really, the sky's the limit. Joe DeFranco talked about, he was working with a 20-yard sprint with a guy, and the guy did some of our old school banded hip stuff where he just put a band around his glute, did an isometric, got access to those positions, and then boom, set the all-time record for that. And turns out that did not slow him down. He couldn't access a position that allowed him to, be as powerful. And so now that became a really useful tool for him that didn't affect his motor output, was able to be highly reproduced and with no equipment, very little equipment, needed a band and a place to anchor it. And then that kid could go do what he needed to do. And I think that's the way we think about this stuff. Yeah,
that's probably helpful for a lot of people listening, or that find themselves in that situation when they're first exposed to it. They think they need to do everything, right? I think that it's like they're confused, they're overwhelmed. Some people have sent me their programs and I look at it and if I'm overwhelmed when I open it, I'm like, oh my gosh, like
That's right. That's right.
no wonder you can't finish it. So and then again, like, what do you need? What do you have right now? And what do you need? I think is what a lot of people need to be looking at. Like, do you need to train every single aspect, or are traditional movements taking care of that? And what are you missing when you're trying to do the thing?
Yeah, go play spike ball or go throw a frisbee for 20 minutes and tell me all the fun shapes you're in. Pull out some, like I have these foam swords I made for our team, and we go fight with foam swords. And I'll tell you, if you want to see a whole bunch of really weird, crazy shapes and kids extended, and like, just go ahead and have a foam sword fight and then try to replicate those shapes and positions. You can't.
Yeah.
And suddenly you're into like, okay, I understand fighting monkey. I understand some of the tennis ball drills and the play drills where we're able to say, hey, at the very least, let's get some exposure to some of these positions and shapes so that it's not like something we have to minister to later. And again, if you actually played a sport, a lot of that athleticism is covered. And so it's important that we're separating, I'm training for a sport with the gym is my life, and it's totally a fine life. It's a fun place to be, but don't confuse that with preparation and athleticism, because what you start to do is if you're in that world, you're going to be like, oh, I understand Cal Dietz now. Like how do I goose the crap out of this physiology in these fundamental shapes in enough that I can still have my athlete go, win an Olympic medal in women's hockey. I think that's really important. And then, at the very least, Juliet and I, we have a mobility coach app, and we have like 230 follow along down regulation sessions in the evening with a ball and a roller. We can begin really sophisticated conversations about your blind spots, about pain, about your position. We do a lot of isometrics in there. But that's an incomplete practice. That's just, I have a ball and a roller, I'm on the ground. Right. That's not going to get us all the way, but it's going to get us a long way towards people feeling better so they can move a little bit better.
Yeah, that's awesome. What's the biggest pushback or skepticism you had when you first started talking about mobility training?
Number one, again, I think the radical idea was that we felt like position was part of the conversation of the gym. And what we were seeing was that coaches couldn't identify full range of motion. They didn't have clear metrics of start position, finish position. They were just like, as long as I got another kilo on the bar, I must be a good coach. As long as I got one more watt, I must be a good coach. And we do want to validate what we're doing with output. I think that's the only thing we can do. What I think is one of the radical ideas was that this belongs in the hands of coaches and belongs in the hands of athletes. The athlete needs to know what her minimums are and what she needs to do. And that it has to be a conversation, not just let's get into it, but like, hey, if you're going to do this complex sport and you can't occupy the positions of the complex sport, barbell training is a complex sport, swimming sport, what are we talking about? All we're going to do is always have like 80% effectiveness, or we're going to have to create a bunch of movement solutions that aren't as effective and potentially set me up for overuse or, tissue sensitivity because, the tissue wasn't sort of intended to work that way. It's easy to forget that the body has so many escape hatches, and thank goodness you can turn that foot out, you can collapse that arch, you can, have a tibial torsion, you can intra-rotate. Thank goodness you can walk no matter what till the end of time. You don't even have to be able to have any shoulder range of motion to feed yourself because you can bend your neck and twist and you have wrists. And so, there's an old Soviet saying that, for example, the hands are clever, which means you can hide a lot of shoulder and elbow problems and stiffness in the thoracic spine because your hands are so good and adaptable. So the key here, I think, was for us to say this has to belong here. And a lot of what we can solve, which are the reasons that people are, hey, my hip hurts, my back hurts. What we found was that there was no conversation of recovery and tissue health, and there was very little conversation about range of motion. And that felt radical to an industry, physical therapy, because we had to basically start to deploy these tools in service of performance. And I think that was, a big, crazy idea.
Yeah. Yeah. I think as a personal trainer, when I started finding the content and, people like you and even Boyle at the time putting certain things out, felt like it was like almost stuff I shouldn't have, if that makes sense. It was
Yeah.
like and it's been good that the industry's grown so much that the education's available like that now to new trainers. But I guess I was looking at stuff that I was like, am I qualified to do this? Right. And it's become so available now through that push that was kind of my reflection. I was thinking you'd say too, is that you'd get pushback on actually delivering it to the hands of the trainers and the athletes themselves. And
And our experience was not that hamstrings exploded and people dislocated their shoulders at all. Why? Because we were always improving positions towards safer positions. We were always restoring range of motion towards better joint congruency, better tissue function. Like it wasn't just like more of everything. Now you can do the splits and now you can wrap your arms and legs around your body. It was always like, hey, let's move you towards better shapes that are more efficient and more effective. And the other thing that we saw was that people could start to really take a crack at feeling better. That in this language where we are trying to help people resolve movement problems, we always say, hey, can this just be easily desensitized? We used to just keep a bunch of, hypervolt percussion devices just on our counter at the gym. And we didn't teach people how to use them. People just walk in, something would hurt and they would hit it and then it would stop hurting and then they'd put it down and they'd go lift. And I was like, perfect solution, right? We could add range of motion, we could do contract, relax, but people would just, vibrate something would stop aching and they would go move. And I would argue that didn't solve a problem, but it made the brain care less about that. So that was a really simple way of desensitizing something. We oftentimes, when people are having a range problem or a pain problem, those tissues are congested and we've got to, decongest those tissues. People are trained like maniacs and then sitting down for the rest of the day. Their training is very dense these days. And, one of the things that we tried to, occupy or have this conversation around is like, would this benefit from just the evacuation of the normal waste products? And turns out that when we got into compression boots or we used an NMES device to create a non-fatiguing muscle contraction, lo and behold, oftentimes those pain things got better and range of motion got better. Did this tissue just benefit from being perfused, just getting a ton of blood flow in there? So suddenly we get tissues that are dry and friable and a little bit hot, and we get the congestion out, which rate limits blood flow. We get the blood flow in with blood flow restriction or easy movement or being thermogenic or prepping that shoulder with, however you want to prep it. And people are like, wow, my shoulder feels great. Let's go lift. And then the last thing that we really hammer on is range of motion, because it's not part of the conversation about pain or position. Someone missed a lift. No one's like, I wonder if this athlete has full range of motion here. It just it's not part of the conversation. And, my back hurts. Well, it's because you had a car accident with your hip in the bottom position and your back suddenly had to start solving that problem. And then you're suddenly like, oh, no wonder Mike Boyle loves these split stances. No wonder he makes these decisions, because he was able to continue to work without having to solve all these problems. He could get the most people, the most bang for the buck with the least sort of effort. And it didn't mean he wasn't using those tools, but he was making this set of decisions based on the people he was seeing. And ultimately, when we began to make position part of the language and part of the thing we're training for, and that everyone understands that that's their responsibility, then we actually take a lot of silly bullshit off the table and we feel better. We have fewer pain. We can get actually more work done. And that's really the magic, because it comes down to the end, whoever can perform the most work wins always.
Yeah, 100%. We've really tackled a lot of the things I wanted to in this episode so far. So that's been great. But I think it'd be good to maybe close up this conversation with a look into the future. And, when you look at the next generation of coaches and athletes, it's evolving so much. Where do you think the conversation about mobility and movement quality is heading? And where do you think it should go?
What's interesting is right now, I would say we're at sort of peak longevity, peak conversations about the fountain of youth, right?
Right. Yeah.
And Juliet and I go to these seminars, these weekend retreats, these conventions where a lot of very sophisticated people are talking about how to live a long time. And one of the conversations there that Juliet and I point out is that like, hey, it's really cool that you're super old, but you're super stiff and in pain and you can't move. And what's the point of having access to all of this? Your telomeres are lengthened. Good job. But you can't sit on the ground, And one time I went in to a local athletic club here called the Olympic Club, which is a very fancy sports club. And they want to do it like an elite talk about mobility and performance. I was like, great. There's no chairs. And just put mats out. And everyone over 50 just suffered. I mean, at the end, people were listening to the lecture, they had to lay down because they couldn't sit. They couldn't side saddle. They couldn't long sit. They couldn't kneel. They had to lay down to listen. And I was like, what are we talking about? So at some point, we want to put this range of motion as part of the things that we're obsessing about. Just like VO2 max, we should be obsessing about maintaining our movement choice. And we may need a sexier term for it than, range of motion. But Julie and I spent over 20 years trying to get people to care about this, and they don't care about it until they're in pain or until they're losing. Then they become real interested in this stuff real fast. Yeah. And maybe that's just a feature because it's not very sexy. It's like eating fiber. Like, no kid is super stoked on like crush my fiber goals today, Dad. This is not what we're doing. So we have to figure out a way to continue to make it part of the conversation of hard training. And that's what we tried to do with our last book. We built to move. We tried to create some vital signs that are really simple and low level so that people can begin to have this conversation of like, hey, if like my blood pressure, I'm off my baseline. What can I do about it?
Right. Yeah. I can, even personally reflect that that's how I got into this more, being the meathead, kind of, taking charge every session and then finding myself in a situation where I couldn't even do the stuff I liked. So I think even experiencing that myself and where I find myself as a coach right now is I have that kind of thought sometimes about like where it's going. But the right people find it at the right time, don't they?
Yeah. And it is a long game here, and it's true when you're 17, what do you need? You need some exposure, some isometrics, a little soft tissue work. That's it. It's not that sophisticated, And suddenly when you're 55 and you have a patina of battle and use and trauma, we may need a different set of power tools. Yeah. Working with a hypermobile yogi or runner is very different than working with a strength athlete. And I need to be able to sort of change directions, change tools, be able to get into that hip of that guy who squats or that girl who squats 700. That's just going to be a different hip than that girl who's going to Pilates, And so, some of the things that we did early on, people like we had one of our friends, Jill Miller, was like, your stuff is way too hard and gnarly. I was like, have you ever worked in my population? And she's like, you would kill the people I work with. And I'm like, that's probably true. You have these really small yogis who are hypermobile and don't have a lot of muscle mass, and it's easy to make change fast. And then she did a course in a strength, and she's like, my stuff is way too soft. It doesn't work. And I was like, I know, like you just have to be able to speak to the person in front of you and be able to dial up and dial down. And again, making a hypothesis, testing your hypothesis, showing that you made change, letting that person experience that change. That is how this works for the long haul.
Yeah, definitely. That was great, Kelly. Do you prefer everyone gets referred to Ready State?
Yeah,
that's where everything is now. Yeah, I'll link everyone up to that. But thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate the discussion. I think there's lots of good stuff here. I think it's good timing as well because, it's great. It's blown up, right? Like everyone's kind of getting it, but I think it's a good time to even just sit down and reflect a little bit about where this started, kind of where it was intended to go, and reflect on those experiences.
I want to give everyone two amazing resources for the research. If you're really looking for thoughtful integration and interpretation research, it's called, I think it's Flexibility Research. It's pretty amazing. And then also I want to put you to the Brooke Bush Institute. Brett Brooke Bush has done, there's a lot there, but his writing about, hip morphology, foam rolling effectiveness, the sciences, this is really an excellent resource there.
Awesome. I'll look more into Brooke Bush's work. Dan was, I've done his work in the past. He played a role in my splits development too over the years.
I love it.
He's got some cool stuff. Yeah.
He's just really amazing, and just quietly, being savage on the internet, going out there and showing people how to make sense of the world.
Yeah.
And don't throw away our elite track and field. Don't throw away our gymnasts. Don't throw away the work done by our martial artists. There's a lot of breadcrumbs there. And just because you're in a gym now with better lighting and you have cooler protein snacks doesn't mean that someone wasn't thinking critically about this a long time ago.
Yeah, for sure. Awesome. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, man.